So what's up people and welcome to the chapters 16 and 17 discussion of Choujin X. So chapters 16 and 17 came out quite a while back and I didn't realize that they had come out. But just recently I went to check up on this series and noticed that these chapters were updated, so I thought I would make this video. Now, as always, I will leave a link to these chapters that are currently being shown on the publisher's official website, Manga Plus, for free to the North American audience. So if you're interested, I will go take a look at it before they pull these chapters back. Okay, so chapters 16 and 17, these were really good chapters. These two chapters may be two of my favorite chapters from this series so far. And it has nothing to do with action or with plot, but more to do with the character interactions and the character development that's continuing to go on. I really like this series a lot because of its in-depth profile of the various characters that come out. And the characters that come out are actually quite charismatic, at least in my opinion. And that makes for a very enjoyable read with regards to this series. Yes, I did like Tokyo Ghoul. It was a very dark, very intense sort of series. But this one attracts me for a completely different reason, which is the kind of the laid back sort of feeling that you get while reading the character interactions that come along. It reminds me of the really wholesome times in Tokyo Ghoul that you sometimes had within the deep dark violence. Here it seems to focus more on those interactions, more so far at least, than the violence. So chapters 16 and 17 continue with that. And if you recall in chapter 15, the end of that chapter came with Ellie deciding to stay in the big city and helping the Yamatomori battle the evil Choujins. And what we find out in chapter 16 is that Ellie has decided to stay at the dormitories in the Yamatomori, and that gives her the ability to stay within her budget and remain in Tokyo. If you recall, she is now a classmate of Tokyo. And in the beginning of chapter 16, we find Ellie preparing to go to school and doing some morning exercises at the Yamatomori Center. Now what we also find is a little bit more information with regards to the Choujins and the Yamatomori organization. It turns out that the good Choujins are called keepers. And these keepers are kind of like peacekeeping patrol forces that investigate and take care of any problems that might arise from the evil Choujins that exist in the world. And so in the case of Ellie, she is a keeper trainee. And by doing so, she can somewhat work as a keeper, but at the same time learn as a student and become a stronger member of the Yamatomori. Other more senior members are people like Simon as well as Momoma. And there are additional high-level keepers that will come out later on in these chapters. But for the beginning of chapter 16, we see Ellie going to school and getting lost somewhere along the way because she doesn't know the path yet. And it turns out that she just happens to run into Asuma, who helps her get to school. Now at this point, the scene changes to Tokyo, who's also coming to school. And what we find out is even though he has recently taken down the baseball Choujin, he's still in his very lack of confidence personality. And he is continuously questioning himself and doubting himself with regards to his capability. And because Ellie has been moving so hard with regards to becoming a keeper, he is constantly comparing himself to Ellie and always finding that he is coming up short. And he eventually does meet with Asuma, and finds out that Asuma has met Ellie, and Asuma is starting to question Tokyo with regards to his concerns. And of course, since Asuma is Tokyo's closest friend, Tokyo opens up with regards to his self-doubt and his worry that people like Ellie will eventually overtake him and he'll be left behind. And what's interesting is Asuma does not argue with Tokyo with regards to this. Seeing how Ellie is with her positive personality, Asuma agrees with Tokyo that if Tokyo doesn't step up in his game, he definitely will be left behind. Now we are also introduced to two other Choujins in this chapter. And the two Choujins are Ricardo and Ririka. And Ricardo is a very interesting Choujin. He has that Thulu sort of Lovecraftian presence, and it's almost impossible to not recognize him as a Choujin. We don't know what his powers are, but considering how he looks, I presume that he's a relatively powerful individual. But in the case of Ririka, we do find out a little bit with regards to her powers. She seems to have something similar to Shikigami powers, so she could create all these paper animals and bring them to life. And what we find out is that Ricardo and Ririka are mercenaries for hire, and they have been hired to look for a certain bird Choujin, which we of course know is Tokyo. Since the evil Choujins, if you recall in the previous chapters, have realized that Tokyo has awakened in his bird form, they are now in constant search of this individual. And so it seems like Ricardo and Ririka have been hired to find this bird Choujin. And so we already have some foreshadowing of the crossing of paths between these two characters and Tokyo, and potentially Ellie and the other members of the Yamato Mori. And chapter 16 ends with Asuma coming back from school late at night. And it's interesting because Asuma is talking to himself, saying he's being somewhat ironic when telling Tokyo that he would be left behind, when he feels he himself is also being left behind, which is an interesting point. We're not exactly sure what Asuma means because we don't even know what Azuma's Choujin powers are. Was he disappointed, and has he become much darker than his original self in the early chapters because he received a Choujin power which he feels is wasteful? That he is not a strong Choujin character? We're not exactly sure, but considering the fact that Asuma was a very positive personality, similar to Ellie, in the early parts of these chapters, and now he seems to be a lot more negative after he has received his Choujin powers, it really does bring up more of a question. What exactly did he receive? But that is something that we won't know in chapter 16, and we will have to continue on to chapter 17. And so chapter 17 starts out with that snake Choujin lady, Nari, being questioned at the Yamato Mori headquarters. And Nari, being Nari, is trying to manipulate the situation so that she could be released as quickly as possible. And the person who's interrogating Nari is a new Choujin that we are introduced to in this chapter named Seiko. And she seems to have Choujin powers that can detect somebody who is lying, and so she becomes a perfect person for interrogating Nari. The only problem is that Seiko is a very weak-willed individual, and she seems to be getting extremely easily manipulated by Nari. And it's at this point that we are introduced to yet another Choujin, whose name is Ichiro. And he seems to be one of the senior Choujins in the Yamato Mori, but he comes in to take over for Seiko. And Nari continues on to see if she can manipulate the discussions and get herself out of this situation. But we do find out what Ichiro's powers are, which is to be able to project images into another person's mind. And so he shows his powers to Nari, and then continues on with the interrogation. And what we find out is that why Ichiro is so good at interrogation is because he does to the people he's interrogating what Itachi did to Kakashi in Naruto, which is to put in some seriously traumatic images into the mind of the target, and by so doing, breaking down the barriers of the individual he's interrogating. And when you realize what sort of images he is putting into Nari's mind, you are reminded that this is a Sui Ishida comic and that he has the ability to go to a severely dark side. What we find out, however, is that after the interrogation, despite the fact that the images that Ichiro showed Nari were so traumatic that she passed out, she still did not give away any information, which seems to indicate that whoever is giving the orders to Nari is such a terrifying individual that she would rather receive the traumatic images from Ichiro rather than to divulge any information. And so we leave the Yamato Mori with Ichiro continuing to interrogate Nari, and we go back to those two mercenaries, Ricardo and Ririka. And we don't get much information here, with the exception of a couple of things. First of all, those paper dogs that she had created in chapter 16 to look for that bird Choujin using their heightened smell have all gathered to a certain part of the city. And so she's starting to realize that the target is somewhere in that location. Now the other which is interesting is that aside from the paper dogs that she has on the map, you notice that she has been creating all these paper knives. So you wonder what her Choujin skill is. It's not just the ability to create living entities from the paper. There may be a possibility that she could create anything from paper, in which case are the knives the weapons that she carries, and she can basically create hundreds and hundreds of knives instantaneously to take out her opponent. We don't know yet, but it is interesting that Sui Ishida is giving us these images to give us some idea of what Ririka's powers are. And with that, we leave Ricardo and Ririka and go back to Tokyo, and we find him standing in front of his school, just hanging out, when he just happens to meet with Momoka. And Momoka goes to a completely different school than Tokyo, but she has come to visit to meet with Ellie. It turns out that she had promised Ellie to go shopping with her because Ellie doesn't know the city too well, and coming from a small country town, she has never really been to a large department store. And since Momoka has met with Tokyo, they go into a conversation, and Tokyo opens up with regards to his indecisiveness. And Momoka, being Momoka, a very nice girl, responds that although she cannot tell Tokyo what to do, she feels that if Tokyo was to become a keeper, he would be a very good one. And considering the fact that Tokyo has a kind of a crush on Momoka, hearing that statement from her does make him feel quite a bit better. And it turns out that Momoka won't be able to take Ellie to the department store because she is called in for an assignment. And so Tokyo decides to take Ellie to the department store instead. And the remaining chapter revolves around her getting completely overwhelmed by the size of the department store as compared to the little tiny shops that she has in her hometown. And it's pretty funny to watch her get all excited over the department store. But while they're there, they encounter an evil Choujin. And we start getting some idea of the creativity of the Choujin powers. I don't know which is more creative, Sui Ishida's Choujin powers or Eiichiro Oda's Devil Fruit powers in One Piece. But they are pretty comparable if we look at this Choujin's powers. So this evil Choujin turns out to be a box Choujin, and his power is to be able to put anybody into a box and pack them up. And so you see already the department store staff packed up into these little tiny boxes, and so Tokyo decides to try to confront him. And before he could do anything, he is packed up into a box, and he realizes that he has completely screwed up. Now, with regards to Ellie, she decides that she would try to use her Choujin powers. The problem is, her Choujin powers are smoke and flame. And since she is in the clothing part of the department store, And since there are a lot of boxes around, she realizes that if she goes all out, she would just burn down the entire store. And here is where we see again a progression in Ellie's Choujin capabilities. She has been practicing them for quite a bit. And now she has the ability to pinpoint attack her target with great accuracy using her smoke powers. And by doing so, she only hits the box Choujin. And since the box Choujin is a box Choujin, when she triggers her flames from her smoke, the box Choujin goes up in flames and she is able to capture him. And by taking down this criminal, the two are commended by a senior Choujin keeper who eventually comes along, and they are given gift certificates from the department store so that they could go shopping. And the chapter ends with Tokyo once again being very self-conscious and complimenting Ellie on how successful she was at apprehending the Choujin. And Ellie, being Ellie, is nice and tells Tokyo that it was the two of them that made this successful, and he should feel proud that he was able to contribute to that. And one thing I have to admit, I'm really starting to like Ellie a lot as one of the characters in this series. Her personality is really interesting. She has this desire to continue to move forward. And despite the fact that she is of small stature and looks like a character that would typically be a victim in any other series, she is turning out to be one of the fastest growing Choujins in this entire series, and her personality seems to be very good. And so I'm really liking Ellie, but of course this puts Tokyo in a much more self-conscious situation. But Ellie doesn't mind, and she really likes hanging out with Tokyo, and she thanks him for taking her to the department store. And the chapter ends with the two of them going back home in the train. Ellie has fallen asleep and has rested her head on Tokyo's shoulder. That makes him a little bit embarrassed. But the interesting shot that we see at the very end is that Tokyo and Ellie are sitting right across from Ririka, who is still in search of the bird Choujin. So this, of course, really does continuously show scenes that these two characters are going to cross paths soon. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future in chapters 18 and 19. And once they come out, I'll bring out another video and hope you join me at that time. But this is the chapters 16 and 17 discussion of Choujin X. Thank you very much for watching, and until the next episode, happy manga reading, and as always, Jaya, nice day everyone.